yeah, with the JH Bavinck stuff, it was that meeting in the library, and then I just started reading his stuff, and I've always found him. I didn't have that. I mean, maybe it's never too late, but I didn't speak Dutch, so I have relied on some of the English translations. It's been great getting to know people like James Eglinton and Gray because they're doing these translate, and there's more of JH Bavinck coming out when people don't mistake him for Herman.
Yeah.
I did a podcast once where they invited me on thinking I was going to be talking about Herman Bavinck, and in the prayer as they were about to press record, we thank Dan who's going to come and talk about Herman Bavinck now, and I had to kind of say to them when it's not, it's his nephew. You've never heard of him, but I think JH is the man for the time, and he's my real kind of he's my real hero. I love the way he writes. I love him as a person. I love his ideas, and so if the Lord leads me to achieve nothing more than just repristinating his ideas, I'll be happy. Yeah.
Well, give me a little
Yeah.
biography of JH Bobby, because again, in the Christian Reformed Church, my grandfather, he's at Raybrook Retirement in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My grandmother is feverishly getting all of his books, so he's finally left with a tiny little bookshelf, and he's got Kuyper systematics and Bavinck systematics in Dutch. And so, in his later years, when he could barely remember what he had just read 30 minutes ago, he's still reading Kuyper and Bavinck in Dutch. I mean, in certain parts of the Christian Reformed
Yeah.
Church, these are we're not allowed to call them saints or to have icons of them, but these are the
Yes.
saints and the icons
Yeah.
of the tradition. But JH is by no means as well
Yeah.
known.
Yeah. So I'm going to get my. I won't. But I did this biographical piece for the handbook. I've forgotten all the different. I know his dates. What I don't know is all the different reformed denominations he was part of, all the initials. But you can
Yeah,
find
don't
those
worry
out.
about that.
So he's born in 1895. Kind of yeah, Christian background. Obviously, his uncle's Herman Bavinck, who's very well known. Um, he goes. He did his. It's interesting. He's always someone who was interested in the emerging discipline of psychology and theology at the same time. So he does his PhD on this reformed mystic called Von Suso, and looking at the kind of mystical tradition. And at one point he says, he his if he was to, the idolatry that he's always trying to stop him in himself is a kind of much more mystical kind of one monistic understanding of life. He gets called onto the mission field. He's in Indonesia in two stints. He ends up teaching in the theological department of Jakarta. Um, he had one little stint when he came back, and that's where he did this book that James Eglinton has just translated called Personality and Worldview, which is a brilliant book. It was to a group of technical students, technical kind of at a technical college. And he makes this great distinction, which I think we need to be using much more between what he calls world vision and a worldview. He says what we think we say that people have got a worldview. Well, at the time, students are starting to think, look, we've got this idea of worldview, but I don't want to be confined by a worldview because I have my own personality. So the book is called Personality and Worldview. And Bavinck's saying what all people are born into is not necessarily a worldview, but a world vision. It's a bit like a compass to try and navigate your way on ground level. What you need to do is you need to work towards a worldview, and they're not many because they're so capacious and thought through. It's more like a map than a compass. And I just think that's great because I think we use the term worldview a lot, and probably we do mean world vision because it's unreflected. Bavinck's thing is you need to consciously work towards a worldview, and then the Christian worldview is the worldview. So he writes this, and then he's back in Indonesia, and he's doing some quite interesting contextualization things. He's really into kind of indigenous expressions of theology, missiologically taking risks in terms of using indigenous rights and to kind of contextualize. He then comes back to Holland and ends up at the Free University, ends up a chair of missions there, and also at Kampen. Um, I mean, I don't know all the details of this because I haven't obviously read all in the Dutch. There's quite a, well, not from his point of view. Klaas Schilder, who's the kind of the leading
Yep.
reformed light at that time, it seems as if he was quite suspicious of JH because he was quite risky. It's interesting, and this is amazing. last year to 18 months ago, I was speaking at a church in Northern Ireland, and this little old lady who must have been in her late 80s, 90s came up and said, I can't believe you're talking about JH Bavinck. He came and preached at my church when I was little. And even then, she was saying he was quite a controversial figure.
Hmm.
Everything you learn about him was that he was the most gentle, humble, peacemaking, conciliatory person. He tries to step in when Skilder's kind of about to leave his denomination, start his own denomination. I think Bavinck was there in quite trying to keep things together, but that didn't happen. So Skilder's quite suspicious of him, and then he ends up, yeah, he finishes teaching. He writes, I suppose his big kind of three works. I mean, he wrote a lot that's still to be translated. This book on religious consciousness, which is in the JH Bavinck Reader, is his main book on uh, exegeting Romans 1, Acts 17, and how that plays out, and this idea of the magnetic points that I think we'll probably come to shortly. Then he does a book called The Introduction to the Science of Missions, which then is translated by Ed Clowney and becomes the standard Reforms missions textbook. And still, I think it's an absolute gem, brilliant book, dated, but you can contextualize for today. And then a posthumous work. He ended up, and this is the thing that I've been involved with. He did these lectures, which I think were in around 1960 at Union Seminary in New York, or the Federated Theological. Um, Mircea Eliade, who was one of he is one of the main in the history of the religious studies. He's one of the main figures.
Yeah.
Eliade, Romanian scholar.
Yeah.
He'd read Bavinck's Religious Consciousness, this little Dutch Reform guy, and invited Bavinck to come over and give these lectures.
Hmm.
And that was published posthumously as The Church Between the Temple and the Mosque, which has similar overlap with Religious Consciousness and Introduction to the Science of Missions. So those three works are kind of his big works. But he's theologically absolutely solid, but at the same time, he's really wanting to push the boat out in terms of engaging others, meeting people in love where they're at. Um, his big discipline that I'm trying to resurrect is this discipline called elenchtics, which comes from 22 times in the New Testament. There's this word called elengo, which means to convict or unmask. And in reform seminaries in the late 19th century, and Kuyper had started it, there were departments of elenchtics. So it's like missionary apologetics. And I still think this is where we need to be housing the study of other religions and apologetics in disciplines of elenchtics. But in the introduction to the science of missions, Bavinck's got a whole section on elenchtics, which I think is really important. So that's an overview. Very loved by his students, seemed a very gentle man. Went through a lot. Two of his sons, they were later released, but they were imprisoned during the Second World War by the Nazis. Um, Ends up dying in 19 June 19 well June the 23rd 1964, and it's interesting, I was born June the 23rd 1974, so 10 years before I was born. So yeah, that's an overview. um
Well, talk to me about the magnetic points. So
yes.
you've written a book now,
Yeah.
and why don't you talk to me about that?
Yeah. So first of all, Bavinck argues that every human being has what he calls a religious consciousness. And his exegesis of Romans 1, Acts 17, and other places. Um, and it's interesting because Bavinck, on the one hand, he's just the classic John Stott, isn't he? He's got the newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other hand, trying to understand the culture around him and understand that biblically. And he says everyone has a religious consciousness, and that religious consciousness is the messy mixture of image bearers of God who both know God and don't know him at the same time, who are running to him as creatures and running away from him as sinners at the same time. So there's this dialectic, this paradox. So religious consciousness isn't there's a God-shaped hole and isn't that great? We need to fill it. It's this is what people do who have been made to worship God but suppress the truth and substitute it for other things. That is religious consciousness. And Bavinck says that that's indestructible. And this is the interest for me because Bavinck's writing in a very multi-religious context in Indonesia in the 1930s and 40s. But I think the theological anthropology is exactly the same for your average person where you are, Paul, or I am, or anywhere. And that's something to discuss. But I think there's a universal theological anthropology of religious consciousness. So there's a lot on that, and that gets into the analysis of idolatry. And he has one of his great illustrations is in Romans 1. It's really hard to understand what's going on about this suppression and substitution. And he says it's a bit like dreaming, and he has this really evocative illustration of a someone who has a dream or a nightmare. That when you have a dream or a nightmare, you imagine something in reality in the day, and then the night in the nightmare, the idea is taken and kind of twisted and distorted and perverted and goes on a completely different trajectory. So, I see a ticking clock in the daytime, and it becomes a monstrous regiment of soldiers in the nightmare. And Bavinck says that's what we do with general revelation. We take something in reality and we twist it to become that kind of, well, what Calvin says is the factory of idols. But the root is always a suppressed truth. There's always base, there's always truth in it, but it's suppressed truth. So it's that weird mix. So that's religious consciousness. And then Bavinck goes a step further to say, well, what does religious consciousness look like? Is there like a morphology? Is there a way you can unpack it? And he says, look, he thinks there are similar, although other religious traditions are saying completely different things, in his experience and from his exegesis, especially of where Paul says in Romans 1:20, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been revealed. And Bavinck's, it's funny, I've read dozens and dozens of commentaries on that verse, and commentators struggle to know why does Paul choose those two things. Bavinck's exegesis, I think, is great here. He says, look, God's eternal power is the idea that at some level we know that we are creatures, and that we are, yeah, we are dependent upon something or someone else. Divine nature is that God has a nature. We're not just there's a personal relationship here, which means accountability. So dependence and accountability before the fall to God, after the fall to the things that we suppress and substitute with. So out of the clay of eternal power and divine nature, Bavinck says there are these well, he calls them direction signals or these magnetic points. He says there are these five questions, issues that people wrestle with all their lives, not consciously, but it's the unpacking of these that how people make decisions in their life in terms of their worldview, their hopes, dreams, desires. And this is what he calls the magnetic points. And there's five magnetic points, and they're all interrelated to one another, and that would be a longer conversation. But and these are my terms. There's totality. Um, is there is this idea? Is there a way to connect? We all want to connect with something. We struggle with being insignificant in our lives, but when we connect with something bigger, something, someone, some cause, we feel connected and we suddenly feel significant. And then when we feel disconnected, we long to connect with something bigger again. So this itch always has to be scratched, says Bavinck. Now, of course, in world religious traditions, there's all kinds of ways you can answer that. You could talk about Allah, you could talk about the Ummah, you could talk about uh, Hindu or Buddhist concepts of oneness anyway. But what's interesting for me is I think that those things are exactly the same in our meta-modern, postmodern context of people wanting to find connection. So is there a way to connect? Norm, is there a way to live? There's always rules that we have, not just the Ten Commandments, but every culture has its own rules, who's in or out. There's norms of behavior. Is there a way out? Deliverance. We look for deliverance. We think there's a problem. The world's not right. What's the problem? We can't agree on that, but we think there is a problem. And what's the solution? And again, it's not just big questions like, what happens when I die or questions of redemption. I mean, I try to understand it in terms of even mini thing, how do I get through the day without another drink? How do I get through the night without the baby crying? It's also a looking back. It's sentimentality and longing. The C.S. Lewis idea of kind of, looking back. The romantics built ruins because it's a kind of, I wish the world was like this. So deliverance is looking forward and looking back. And then there's destinies. They're a way that I control. And here Bavinck has got this great line. He says, we both lead our lives and we undergo our lives at the same time. And really, the history of philosophy, but also at a street level, are we in control or are we under someone else's control? And Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I think I'm the master of my own destiny. I can do what I want. I have agency. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'm a puppet on a string. I'm a pawn in a game. I'm just a victim. What's really interesting about doing this with churches and getting them to think about these questions, I've done this like in different countries all over the world now. So, for example, I went to Slovakia and I've done it a few times in Slovakia. And the Slovaks, when I speak to a group of pastors, I said, does Slovak culture think that you're in control or under someone else's control? We did a Slido poll. 99.7%. We are always a nation that think that we're under someone else's control. First, it was the Austro-Hungarians, then it was the Czechs. We're the bottom of the pile. No one bothers us about us. There's no point in doing anything because nothing will change. We have no agency. Now, can you imagine any American church where I've done this material? No American says
No,
that.
no, no, no. We are the
This is
masters of our own destiny.
exactly. So it's really interesting how that magnetic point kind of is configured, which I do think leads to a lot of the way that you approach apologetics or the gospel. So you've got these 4 points. You've got, totality, a way to connect, norm, a way to live, deliverance, a way out, destiny, a way we control. And then the final magnetic point, which I call the meta magnetic point, I suppose, is Bavinck calls it higher power. But the question is there a reality beyond reality? And what's interesting is that I think in Bavinck's context in Indonesia, everyone believes in a higher power. The question is, what's the higher power through which I get connection that gives me the norm, that delivers me, that I have a relationship with in terms of destiny?
What higher power system works?
Exactly. In the post-Christian secular West, it's the point that's most buried that needs to be excavated. And I think you get to it through the other points. So it's much more on the surface, I think, in Bavinck, other religious contexts. It needs to be excavated. But I think the way that you get there is by pushing on the other 4 points to get there. Um, and so Bavinck says, that these points are interrelated and they're all don't compartmentalize them. They're all interrelated and they all speak in there are perspectives on the one religious consciousness. And so that's his exposition. And then, well, he does it. There's a certain way that I've done it. I've become well. I've used this phrase a lot, and Tim Keller used it a lot. It was by another Dutch missionary, a guy called Hendrik Kramer, another Dutch Reformed missiologist. And Hendrik Kramer, just for a minute, this is a sidebar, just for a minute. We'll get back to the magnetic points in a minute. Hendrik Kramer was very instrumental. He was like the polymath at these great big missionary conferences at the beginning of the 20th century in Edinburgh and India, Tamboran. And he's quite influenced by Barth. He's a bit more Barthian than I would be, Kramer. But at the time, people are starting to say, look, we know that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of religion, but we think other religions might be like stepping stones to Jesus. So you have books like The Unknown Christ of Hinduism, where people are saying Jesus is the fulfillment of other religions. And so Kramer kind of slams his hand on the table and says, no, 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 no. Jesus is completely different. You cannot compare other religions to the revelation of Jesus Christ. But if you want to use the word fulfillment, maybe Jesus is the contradictive or subversive fulfillment of other religions. Now, Kramer only uses that phrase once in a little essay he wrote. As I joke, I'm trying to build a theological career on it. But I do think this subversive fulfillment idea is absolutely brilliant. And, I always, what 1 Corinthians 1, you just see this, the gospel, Christ crucified, is foolishness. There's a confrontational message that is completely different from the world's message. It's utter foolishness. It's confrontational. And yet in that passage, Paul and Tim talked about this as well. Paul talks about two ethnic groups, Jews and Greeks. What I mean, why does he bother mentioning them? He could have just said Jesus is completely different. I don't care what you believe. But he says they're Jews and Greeks. They have different worldviews, social imaginaries. Jews look for power, Greeks look for wisdom. And so Christ crucified is foolishness and a stumbling block, but to those who believe Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. In other words, we might say, well, Paul, isn't that a felt needs gospel? You mean Jews are looking for power and Jesus is power, Greeks are looking for wisdom and Jesus is wisdom? Yes, in precisely a subversive way that they would expect, because a crucified Messiah is not powerful or wise. And yet, Paul is willing to speak in their cultural narrative to bring Jesus into the conversation. And so my big point to churches are in our apologetics, in our engagement, Christ always confronts and he connects at the same time. And some of us are great at the confrontation, but we don't do the connection. And some of us are great at the connection and don't do the confrontation. And it seems to me that phenomenologically or in an exemplary model, that's exactly what Paul's doing in Acts 17, because he's wandering around the objects of worship. And he could have said, hey, it's going to be really complicated if I try and get to Jesus from this unknown God, because they might just think the unknown God is Jesus. But he does start where they're at, and yet he completely subverts, because the unknown God isn't Jesus, but he starts where they're at. And so subversive fulfillment, I think, is a very powerful model of understanding the relationship between the gospel and culture. So, final piece, taking that idea of subversive fulfillment back to the magnetic points. And Bavinck doesn't talk about subversive fulfillment like this, but I think this is helpful. All of the magnetic points are subversively fulfilled in Christ. Christ is the way that we find connection, both communion with God and community in the church, but in a subversive way, because we have to give give ourselves into union with him without losing our individuality. So we're not just kind of uh part of the great abyss of being. We have individuality, but we still die to ourselves. Christ is the norm. Jesus is pro moral, the moral conservatives, where the moral law doesn't change, but he's for progressives who are against religious hypocrisy and the outsiders. Jesus is the one who delivers us, in most importantly, from the coming wrath. Jesus is the one who is both in control and our loving Heavenly Father. It's not an impersonal force. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So it's trying to understand in the book, especially, how Jesus in his person and work both subverts and fulfills those magnetic points in order, therefore, for us to get traction. My big thing is, especially in our post-Christian situation, where we don't have that Christian literacy or people are completely nowhere. I want to say to people, these are still religious people and they are living their lives out with the magnetic points. And you don't have to segue in an awkward way to get to Jesus, because people are religious. And what we need to do, if you can understand, if this framework of the magnetic points helps, try to think about where are they looking for connection, where are they looking for the norm, because they will be, because they're image bearers. And then how do we naturally then say something about Christ, who both confronts and connects with them at the same time? So the magnetic points framework is trying to be uh, a helpful tool, X-ray vision, for us to understand people who we think these people have got nothing. Because I've been very influenced in Isaiah chapter 41, the passage about the idolater who makes their dinner or supper and then uses the fuel and makes a god, and the whole point is ridiculous. But Isaiah 44, 40, no, 44:10, I think, Isaiah 44:10, about the idolater, Isaiah says, no one stops to think. And I try to say to churches, your average non-Christian, your average non-Christian friend isn't having a podcast on how not to be a non-Christian with a guy in the States. People are just living their lives. And yet I think part of our job is to make people stop and think, like the Jeremiah 2, do you know that you're drinking from a cracked cistern here that can't hold water, and there's a fountain of living water here? but we struggle to get traction because people are just so far post-Christian in my context. But I want to say they're religious. All the stuff that I've been telling you is true. And the great thing about Bavinck is that he was very hardline on this. So he says, there's no such thing as the Christian faith accommodating to other religious worldviews. There's accommodation isn't right. We need to repossess. We need to possess. But he's very big on meeting in love. He says, there's no difference between you and the person who you're speaking to about Jesus. The wounds which you're going to inflict on them, God has inflicted on you first. And we're just one another in love. It's, one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. So that's the magnetic points framework. And then there's a few steps I've gone on there to talk about. First of all, we need to apply the magnetic points to ourselves because it's when we're magnetized that people are attracted to Christ through us. And how do we stay magnetized? So in the book, it's no great shakes. It's basically the ordinary means of grace. A friend of mine read the book and said, and he meant this as a compliment. He said, I found the ending very, very anticlimactic. But it was because at the end of the day, we stay magnetized by word and sacrament, gathering together, being remagnetized, orientated every week and sent back out. And so our evangelism flows from our discipleship. The more that we're magnetized and in love with Christ, the more people will see Christ through us. There's no great magic bullet there. There's no new technique. It's the ordinary means of grace. And then the third thing I think, which is I think very interesting in why I'm interested in your work, is I think Keller's last article before he died was this article called Lemonade on the Porch, where he said that just like lemonade is served on the porch of an American house in your typical American street as a gateway into someone's house, the culture has been the glass of lemonade. The culture has been the porch, but the porch isn't there anymore. So how do we create porches, third spaces, I suppose, that are linked to the church, adjacent, but not part of? And so I'm trying to pilot some things in the UK and elsewhere that I'm calling magnetic spaces that are opportunities for, uh, well, I'm calling it pre-evangelism because I think in our polarized kind of siloed culture, we don't have the opportunity to do pre-evangelism because we're not socially engaged with anyone.
Yeah.
How do we engage people where they're at? And I think the magnetic points then form a great kind of scaffold or framework for a magnetic space. Because in my context, I don't know if it's the same for you, Paul, but there's always two sides of the horse that evangelicals are falling off on. You either go for bait and switch, we're going to do a course on mental health, and within 5 minutes they're thinking this isn't a course on mental health. This is someone trying to talk about Jesus. Or you just have social gospel, which doesn't mention Christianity at all.
Right.
And I think the magnetic points give a kind of a background integrity that you can put different canvases on according to the interests in your community or your church. But they stop that bait and switch because these are human questions that we can just answer and discuss together. But they do then give an opportunity to show how, as a Christian, Jesus answers these magnetic points. So as I say, conversational difference, and I think the importance of convicted civility, where we are able to have conversations where we disagree, can lead to conversional difference, because then someone might go away someone might go away from a magnetic space thing and think, I thought the Christians were completely crazy, but actually it did help me think that the beliefs and views and my life is actually connected to some commitments that I have I'd never thought about before. That's great for the gospel. On the other hand, it could be, hey, those Christians said something, and I'm really interested in thinking about this a little bit more. They spoke about Jesus. So the magnetic spaces idea, and there's been a few things that have been tried in teaching English as a second language. There's a great resource where this organization have taken 50 proverbs from around the world to teach people English. So you're learning English at the church. You're learning proverbs, which are distilled worldviews of different cultures. And then there's an opportunity to talk about bridge proverbs, which link to one of the magnetic points, and then give an opportunity maybe to say something about Christ. But there's all kinds of things you could do: sports clubs, film clubs, book groups, but the magnetic points do give a kind of a theological integrity that, again, don't immediately go bait and switch or don't go to social gospel, which can be the problem. So that's Diego. Sorry, I've been rambling on.
No,
That
that's
is the
good.
magnetic points idea framework. There we are.